What if America never sent troops to Vietnam? No draft protests, no televised war, no Vietnam syndrome. Would Southeast Asia have fallen to communism, or would peace have come sooner? In this alternate history, we explore a world where the United States never entered Vietnam. Let's see how this one decision could have reshaped the Cold War, global politics, and even modern America itself. To understand what might have been, we first need to remember what actually happened. After World War II, Vietnam was divided, North under communist rule, South backed by the West. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, stepped in to support South Vietnam. What began with a few military advisors in the 1950s escalated into a full-scale war by the mid-1960s. At its height, more than 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam, and over 58,000 lost their lives. The conflict was fought not only in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but also in the streets of America, where protests, music, and media questioned the war's purpose. By 1975, Saigon fell, uniting Vietnam under communist control and leaving behind decades of division and trauma. This is the world we know. But now, imagine if the United States had never stepped in at all. Every alternate history begins with one crucial decision. In this timeline, that moment comes in 1964, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. In our reality, President Lyndon B. Johnson used it to justify sending American troops and launching massive bombing campaigns. But in this alternate world, Johnson hesitates. Intelligence reports are uncertain, public support is weak, and the cost of another war feels too high. Instead of escalation, he chooses restraint. The United States limits its role to economic aid, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic pressure. American aircraft carriers remain in the Pacific, but the boots never hit the jungle floor. Without US intervention, South Vietnam must fight largely on its own, supported only by small allies like Australia and Thailand. It's a decision that changes everything: the course of the Cold War, the fate of Southeast Asia, and the very identity of America itself. Without American troops on the ground, the war in Vietnam unfolds very differently. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, still pushes for unification, but progress is slower, limited by resources and logistics. South Vietnam, lacking US air power and funding, struggles to maintain control. By the late 1960s, much of the countryside leans toward the north, while the cities cling to fragile independence. The conflict drags on, smaller in scale, but still brutal. Across the region, the effects ripple outward. Laos and Cambodia see communist movements rise, though without the devastating bombings that scarred them in our reality. China offers quiet support, but avoids direct confrontation, wary of Soviet influence. Southeast Asia becomes a political chessboard, tense, but not consumed by war. And while the US watches from afar, the world begins to ask, without America's military presence, does Asia find balance or chaos? While Southeast Asia struggles on its own, life in the United States follows a very different path. Without the Vietnam War, there's no draft, no waves of young Americans forced overseas. College campuses remain passionate, but not divided by the fear of conscription. The massive anti-war protests of the late 60s never ignite. President Lyndon B. Johnson turns his full attention to the Great Society, expanding education, civil rights, and healthcare. Billions that would have been spent on bombs now fund schools and poverty programs. The civil rights movement gains stronger momentum, facing fewer political distractions. The 1968 election unfolds peacefully, and the American public grows more confident in its leaders. Culturally, the counterculture still rises, but it's less angry, more hopeful, centered on progress rather than protest. By avoiding Vietnam, America sidesteps one of the most divisive chapters in its history, emerging more united, prosperous, and idealistic, at least for now. Without the Vietnam War draining its strength, America faces the Cold War from a position of confidence. The US keeps its global credibility intact, its military untested, its economy strong, and its people far less divided. Washington channels its resources into space exploration, technology, and diplomatic pressure on the Soviet Union. But as the US steps back from Southeast Asia, the balance of power begins to tilt. Communist movements spread more freely through Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Yet, rather than uniting under Moscow, they deepen the split between the Soviet Union and China, who now compete for influence across Asia. By the 1970s, détente arrives earlier. The US and USSR pursue arms control, and the world inches closer to stability, without the shadow of a lost war haunting Washington. Decades later, the effects of America's choice ripple through the modern world. Without Vietnam, the US avoids the trauma of defeat, the so-called Vietnam Syndrome. Its leaders remain more confident in foreign policy, perhaps intervening earlier in places like Afghanistan, Iran, or Africa. The absence of massive war spending leaves trillions redirected into science, education, and space exploration. By the 1990s, the United States stands even stronger, its economy booming, its technology decades ahead. American culture also evolves differently. Fewer protest songs, fewer films about war, and a generation unscarred by televised conflict. Yet, without Vietnam's lessons, the US might grow too confident, forgetting the limits of military power. A single decision, one war avoided, changes not just a generation, but the entire direction of history. History often turns on a single decision. Sometimes it's the choice to act, and sometimes it's the choice to step back. In this alternate world, America never enters Vietnam. The names of distant jungles, Khe Sanh, Hue, Saigon, never become symbols of loss. No draft tears families apart. No nightly images of soldiers and protests divide a generation. Without the war, the United States moves through the 1960s with its confidence intact. The Great Society expands. The civil rights movement gains greater momentum, and the country's faith in its institutions remains unbroken. But every decision carries its own shadow. Without Vietnam's painful lessons, the US may enter future conflicts more eagerly, untested by failure, unaware of the human cost that war demands. The caution that later shaped American foreign policy never truly forms. Meanwhile, Southeast Asia still struggles. North Vietnam eventually unites the country, but without the scale of destruction seen in our world. Cambodia and Laos face unrest, though fewer foreign bombs fall on their soil. This timeline isn't a paradise, it's simply a different path, one where peace came not from victory, but from restraint. And that's the power of what if. One decision, one hesitation, can rewrite the destiny of millions. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that sometimes the most courageous act in history is the choice not to fight. This is the world that might have been if the United States never entered Vietnam.